We continue now at the top of Daf Chafam Aleph Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 20a. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked a contradiction from our Mishnah against the Mishnah in Nedarim. In our Mishnah, the Mishnah says when the person says Shavuos she'ochel, it means to say an oath that I am going to eat. Whereas in Nedarim, it's the exact opposite. When he says Shavuos she'ochelach, it's interpreted as a shvuah that the person is saying he is not going to eat. And so Abai resolves the contradiction by saying that it depends on the context. In one case, we're talking about a situation where people around him are urging him to eat. And in the other case, we're talking about a situation where people are urging him that he should not, misarvin bolechol, they are not urging him to eat. As the Gemara now continues and explains, masnis in our Mishnah, b'she'ein misarvin bolechol, that's talking where they are not urging him to eat. And brisa, in the case of the brisa, and again, it's not really a brisa, it's actually the Mishnah in Nedarim. In the case of the Mishnah in Nedarim, b'misarvin bolechol, that's talking where they are urging him to eat. V'ka'amar, and he's responding and saying, lo achilna v'lo achilna, he's saying, I'm not going to eat, I'm not going to eat. And so therefore, therefore we interpret his shvuah when he ultimately takes that shvuah and he says shvuah she'ochel, hachi kamar, what he's actually saying is shvuah shelo ochel. He's taking an oath that he is not going to eat. And the Gemara continues, Rav Ashi says a different answer, Tani shvuah she'i ochelach. Really what it should say is shvuah she'i. It's not shvuah she'ochel, but shvuah she'i ochelach, which again is a shvuah that the person is saying, I am not going to eat. And the Gemara continues, Hachi, if so, if that's the case, why does that even need to be said? And the Gemara continues and answers, Ma'u detema, what might you have said? Lishnei de iskelele. What happened was his tongue slipped and he actually meant to take a shvuah that he was going to eat. And so Kamash Malon, so that's what it's teaching us. Again, the Mishnah in Nedarim is teaching us that what he says, we take what he says exactly as he says it. Shvuah she'i ochelach, again, is a shvuah that he's not going to eat. And we will note as well that the reason why the Gemara here is referring to it as a brisa, even though again it is a Mishnah in Nedarim, it means to say the Mishnah from the external source, from the other Mesechet, again referring to the Mishnah in Nedarim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Mivta, the language of Mivta, that's a shvuah that refers to an oath. Isser, the language of Isser as well, Shavuot, that refers to an oath. Isser, the prohibition created by an Isser. Imata Omer Isser Shvuah, if you say that an Isser is an oath, so Chayiv, then the person is liable. V'imlav, and if not, Pater, then the person is exempt. And Rashi explains, Isser Shavuot, again, Isser refers to a Shavuot, Mefarish Lakameh, this will all be explained later on. Isser, the prohibition created by Isser, meaning Isseroso shel Isser, again, that prohibition of Isser, Mahu, what is that? And so again, the Gemara said to that, if you say that Isser is a shvuah, then we say liable, and if not, pater. And the Gemara now asks, Imat ha'omer Isser shvuah, if you say an Isser is a shvuah, what does that mean? V'amrit Isser shvuah, but you just said above at the very top line of the brisa that an Isser is a shvuah. So what is the brisa suddenly asking or saying if you say an Isser is a shvuah? And Rashi explains, Imat ha'omer Maiko Amr, what are you saying? V'amrit Isser lashon shvuah, you just said that Isser is a language of shvuah. V'hadr tani Imat ha'omer, and then all of a sudden the brisa says, if you say Isser is a shvuah. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Abaya says, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Brisa is saying. Mivta shvuah, first it says again, Mivta is shvuah. And Rashi explains, Hachi Kamar Mivta Shvuah, Ha'omer Mivta Kikar Zu Alai. If a person says the language of Mivta, that this kikar, that this loaf is upon me, Ka'omer Shvuah Shelo Ochalnu, that's like a Shvuah, that's like an oath. The person is essentially saying, I am not going to eat this loaf. V'imachlo, and if he does eat it, Hareza Ba'olav Yored, so then he brings the carbon, Olav Yored, again that's the sliding scale chatos, the chatos changes depending on how wealthy the individual is. And Abaya continues and explains, then the Brisa says, Isser mitvas b'shvuah. Isser, that's a mitvas b'shvuah. And Rashi explains what that means. Isser mitvas b'shvuah means, Isser alai kikar zu. Let's say the person says, with the language of Isser, upon me, this particular loaf. Harehu kemishin nishba al kikar. That is again like taking an oath on that loaf. The chazer v'yamar al kikar acher. And then the idea of mitvas is when you take something, you take a shvuah from one item and you put it onto another. So now he goes ahead and says on a different loaf, Harezeh kozeh, that this should be like this, Shehitvis es hasheni barishon, that essentially he takes the prohibition that's on the first one and he puts it on the second one. And Abaya continues his answer, Isser, when it comes to the prohibition created by the language of Isser, and Rashi explains, Isser, umau isuro shel Isser zeh, what is the prohibition of this language of Isser? So imata omer, if you say mitvas b'shvuah, that when somebody creates an oath by association, Kemotzi shvuah mipivdami, it's like actually pronouncing that exact oath. So then chayiv, then we say liable, v'imlav, and if not pater, then we say exempt. And Rashi explains, Ima Omer means to say as follows. Im Tim Solomar, if you're going to say, Shahamatvis b'shvua, that if somebody does an association by an oath, Kemotzi shvua mipiv dami, that that's the equivalent of actually pronouncing a shvua, V'yimachlo chayiv karban, and in such a situation, if the person eats what he wasn't supposed to eat, he's chayiv a karban. So av zeh, so too over here, ha'omer iser kikor zeh olai chayiv karban. If somebody says the words iser kikor zeh olai, it's chayiv a karban. Imachlo, if he eats it, shah iser, because this word iser, loshon hatfasas shvuahu. That's a language of hatfasa. It's a language of trying to create an oath by association. V'yimla, but if not, sha'amatzvis b'shvua eino kenishba le'inyan karban u'malchus, that somebody who does a shvua by association, it's not considered to be like an oath in terms of karban and malchus. So afo iser, so too when it comes to the language of iser, ein volo karban volo malchus. There's not going to be karban, there's not going to be malchus in such a situation. And we will take a look at Tosfos for an alternative explanation. Iser mitvas b'shvua, again, by Iser, that's mitvas b'shvua, that's like a shvua by association. Perish b'kuntris, first Tosfos quotes Rashi. Rashi explains, Dimamar Iser alai kikar zeh, if a person says Iser alai kikar zeh, have a kamisha nishba ala kikar, so it's like he's taking an oath on that loaf. V'chazor v'yamar al kikar acher harezeh kazeh, and then when he says on another loaf that this is like this one, shehitvis es hasheni barishon, he's associating the second with the first. Because Tosfos asks, that's difficult. To lekamon katani bebrisa, because later on the brisa is going to say, Ezo iser ha'amar b'torah harei olai. What's an iser? Iser means the person says harei olai. V'ilu iser kikar zeh olai lo katani. Doesn't say this language over here of iser kikar zeh olai. Umashe berish nami, and also what Rashi explains in terms of the next line, that iser, he says the prohibition created by iser. Kilomar iser shel iser zeh madino. What is the prohibition created by this iser? Ima to omer matvis b'shvua, if you say a shvua by association is a shvua, so then liable over here as well. Shetucha lohochiach mikra b'shum makom shukimotzi shvua mipiv, that you can prove again in some area that it's the same, association is the same as actually saying a shvua. V'chayiv karban, you're chayiv karban there, so af iser zeh, so too by iser. So this is also difficult, says Tosfos. Kasha, it's difficult. Dimashma, it sounds like the Tana bola ashminan, that the Tana, the Bryce, is coming to teach us din iser. He's teaching us some halacha that's relevant to using the language of iser. But he's not teaching us anything. Sharim mistabik b'matvis shvua atzmo, because the Tana doesn't even know what the halacha is in terms of association by shvua in general. V'yoden further, de'ein derech mishnah u'braisa, it's not the way of a mishnah and brisa, sheyistabik hatana im chayev o potter, that the Tana would have some kind of doubt, chayev or potter. V'yoden further, mai v'oz delatayme dekamar lakamon. Later on, we're going to say that he's following his reasoning. Dehacha mistafka leili Abaya, because over here there's a doubt according to Abaya. Ulakamon pshita, and later on we're going to see that it's obvious the chemotzi shvua mipiv dami, that it's considered as if he's actually pronounced a shvua. V'yoden further, the v'chol asvarim garsinan b'samach chemotzi shvua mipiv v'chayev bevav, and all of the svarim, the text that we have is it says that it's like he said a shvua and he's chayev with a vav. Well, the perish hakuntras, but according to Rashi's explanation, havalei leminkat chayev below vav, it should have simply said chayev without a vav. And so therefore, Mefarish Rabbeinu Tam explains the brisa as follows. The mivta hakosav beparsha, when it says the word mivta in the parsha, again, when it's talking about Nedarim and Shevuos, that word mivta, hu lashon shvua, that's a language of Shvua. Shenishba beloshon mivta, because he's taking an oath using the word mivta, using that kind of language. Kidaperish nami bekuntras, that Rashi also explained in terms of that part. Avol iser hakosav beparsha, but when it says the word iser in the parsha, eino shvua sheyasar atzma b'lashon iser, it does not mean to say that he's prohibiting himself with the word iser, with the language of iser. Ela b'matvis b'shvua hakosav medaber, rather, the word iser in the pasuk is a reference to matvis b'shvua. It is a reference again to a shvua by association. Shenish ba'al hakikar, that he took an oath on a loaf, v'chazor v'yamar al kikar acher, and then he said about a different loaf, harei olai shelo ochel kikar zeh, that it's upon me not to eat this kikar kazeh, just like this one, v'hainu iser dekra, and that is what we mean when it says again iser. That's what the pasuk means when it says iser. And Tosfos continue, v'hachinami mefarish la bebrisa le'abai, and this is also what Abai is explaining in terms of how to understand the brisa. The iser shel iser zeh. Again, the brisa goes on to say the prohibition created by iser means to say as follows: imata omer matvis b'shvua. If you say that association by shvua, kilomar, meaning shehitviso b'kikar shenishba olav, meaning if you're going to do a hatfas, if you're going to do an association using the word iser, have a kimotzi shvuah mipiv v'chayiv. So that's like a shvuah, and he's chayiv. But v'imlav, but if not, shelo itfiso ba'acher, if we're not talking about association, elo amar, but rather he simply says iser kikor ze olai. He just uses a language of iser kikor ze olai. Ein ze lashon shvuah. This is not a language of shvuah. Upater, and he will be exempt. Essentially, the Bryce is going on to explain that the word iser is specifically used by association. It's not just a word that is used to create a shvuah. And the Gemara continues, Umimai de mifta shvuah. Now, from where do we know that mifta refers to an oath? Because it's written in the pasuk, O nefesh kisishava levate bisvasayim. It says a person's going to swear, and it's levate, uses the word levate, that refers again to an oath. But by that logic, iser nami. You should say the same exact thing by iser, because it's written, Kol neder v'chol shevuas iser. It calls it shevuas iser. It seems to be, again, some kind of an oath. So, ella rather, mimai de iser mitvas b'shvuhu. Where do we know that iser is mitvas b'shvuhu? It refers to this kind of association by an oath. Because it's written, O Asra Israel Nafsha Bishvua. It says it's Asra Israel Nafsha Bishvua, and that language, saying it's Bishvua, sounds like association. But if you're going to use that logic, Mifta Nami Haksib, by Mifta also it uses that kind of language. It's written, L'chol Asher Yevate Adam Bishvua, it uses the word Bishvua. Again, it sounds like association. So how do we know that we make a distinction that, again, Mifta is an oath, but Isser refers to association? El Amar Abaya, rather, Abaya says, Mifta shvuah mehacha. The way we know that mifta is shvuah, that's from here, from the following pasuk. V'im hayosia leishun edoreh oleh o mifta sifaseh asher asra al nafsha. It talks about mifta sifaseh ve'ilu shvuah lo kamar. It doesn't mention shvuah, so you see that mifta itself is shvuah. So b'mai asra atzma b'mifta. Obviously, how does she prohibit herself? Through mifta. You see again that mifta is a shvuah, and so that's how we know that. That's how we know that the word mifta refers to shvuah. But again, iser is going to be association. And the Gemara continues with another approach to the Brisa. Rava Amar, Rava says, Liolamei malach, really I'm going to say to you, mitvas b'shvua lav kemotzi shvua mipiv dami, that association by a shvua is not the same as expressing the shvua directly. V'hachi kamar, and this is what it's saying in the Brisa, mivta shvua. Again, mivta is a shvua, that's an oath. Isser nami shvua, and Isser also is an oath. And Isser de Isser, the prohibition by Isser, hitilu hakasa bei neder l'shvua. The pasuk is placing it between neder and shvua, and the idea is as follows: hotzio b'lashon neder, neder. If the person expresses it in a language of neder, it is a neder. B'lashon shvua, shvua. And if a person expresses it in a language of shvua, then it is a shvua. And Rashi explains, Rava Amar, Rava says, Lo istapikle latana lemeimar boha imata omer. It's not a suffix to the Tana in terms of this, if you're going to say this idea of mitzvahs. The pshita le de mitzvahs b'shvua lav kemotzi shvua mipivu. It's obvious to the Tana that mitzvahs b'shvua is not considered the same as expressing the shvua directly. V'achi kamar, mifta shvua isser nami lashon shvuhu. And what the Bryce is saying is, mifta is a language of shvua, and isser nami is a language of shvua. And isser zeh hitilu hakasav. And again, this isser, the pasuk placed it between neder and shvua. Hainu perish the isser isser. This is the Gemara is explaining now. What is the explanation of the words in the Brisa where it said isser isser, the prohibition of isser? Imata omer, if you say v'hachi kamar, it means as follows: Isser shel shamarti lach. This prohibition of isser that I mentioned, shehu shavua, which again it is a shvua. Lo kol halashonos shavos bo. Not all languages are treated the same by it. Sharehitilu akasa bein neder l'shvua, because the pasuk places it between neder and shvua, and the idea is im amirosa b'lashon shvua, if it is said over in a language of an oath. And what's a language of an oath? Could go in iser shelo ochel kikar zeh. An oath, a shvua, would be when a person says, I'm not going to eat this particular loaf, and he uses the word iser. Kain lashon hanishboy, and that's the way that people take shvuos. Omrim shelo ochel. They say the person says he's not going to eat. Afo iser shahot sio b'lashon zeh shvuah. So if a person uses the word iser in this way, that's a shvuah. V'chayev carbon, and it's chayev a carbon. V'im lav. Now, if this is not the case, el hotzio b'lashon neder. Rather, he uses it in the formulation of a neder. Sha'amar. What's the formulation of a neder? He says iser kikar zu olai. There you're placing it more on the object. He says iser, this loaf is upon me. Shehu lashon hanodrim. That's the language that's used by neder. Konem ze olai, for example, konem ze olai. Af ze neder. So too, this would be a neder when he's using the word iser in this way. Upater mi carbon. He's going to be pater from a carbon. And the Gemara continues, Heichon hitila, where do we find that this word iser is placed between neder and shvua? Because the pasuk says, Vim beis isha nadara, there's the word neder. O asra iser al nafsha, there's the word iser. B'shvua, and then the pasuk uses the word shvua. So you see again, the word iser is placed between neder and shvua. And the Gemara continues, V'azdu l'taimayu, these two opinions of Abai and Rava, they're following their opinions in another context, to Itmar, because it was stated as follows. Matfis b'shvua, when it comes to matfis b'shvua, again, exactly the case we're discussing, when the person does a shvua by association, Abai Amar kimotzi shvua mipiv dami, Abai says that's the same as actually pronouncing the shvua directly. The Rava Amar, and Rava says, Lav kimotzi shvua mipiv dami. Rava says it's not considered like expressing the shvua directly. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question from the following Brisa. Eza Isser ha'omer b'Torah, what is referred to in the Torah when it says Isser, what is that talking about? Ha'omer harei olai shelo ochel basar, let's say a person says, it's upon me not to eat meat, v'shelo eshte yayin, or I'm not going to drink wine, ki yom shemeis bo aviv, like the day that his father died, we'll see Rashi in a moment, ki yom shemeis bo ploni, or like the day that so-and-so died, or ki yom sheneherag bo Gedalia ben Achikam, or like the day that Gedalia was killed, or ki yom sheroy Yerushalayim b'chorban, or like the day that he saw Yerushalayim in its destruction, so usher, so that it is in fact prohibited, and that neder is going to be chal. V'yamar Shmuel, and Shmuel says, V'husha nadar uba meyoso hayom. This is only true if that neder actually was in place from that day. And Rashi explains, Ki yom shemeis bo aviv, he says again that it's harei olai shelo ochel basar, let's say, and he says ki yom shemeis bo aviv, which means kasher asarti olai basar, just like I already prohibited upon myself meat, biyom shemeis bo abel yolam, on the day that father died forever. And Shmuel said, V'husha nadar uva me'oso hayom. It has to be that the neder was made from that day. Meaning, Shekibel olav kvar neder shelo yochal basar. He already accepted upon himself a neder not to eat meat. B'yom shemeis bo aviv liolam. Again, on the day that his father died forever. V'chein yom shemeis bo ploni, or also the day that so-and-so died. V'chein yom shenerag bo Gedalia. Also the day that Gedalia ben Achikam died. Again, the idea is, let's say on the day that his father died, he said that day he's never going to have meat. And so he already had that neder in place. And Rashi continues and explains, V'kasal kadai tahashla, right now we think, Dehainu matfis beneder. That's essentially a neder by association. He's saying that I'm prohibiting upon myself meat or wine, just like I prohibited it upon myself on the day that father died. Again, that it would always be usher to have those things on that day. The Katani, and what does it say? It says, Ezo Isser ha'amr b'Torah. What is Isser that stayed in the Torah? Shehul below Yachel devaro, again, where he has to keep that he has to keep that oath, he has to keep that neder. Ha'omer harei olai, that's if he says harei olai. And what's the point? Alma, we see from this brisa, hamatzvis beneder, if somebody makes a neder by association, harehu below yachel keneder atzmo, it has the same power of lo yachel like a regular neder, it's an effective neder. Umidav matzvis beneder neder, and from the fact that a neder by association is a neder, matzvis b'shvua, shvua, it would seem to be that matzvis b'shvua is also going to be an effective shvua. That's the point of asking from this brisa. As the Gemara now continues, B'shlom li Abaya, this brisa makes sense according to Abaya. Midamatvis beneder neder, from the fact that a neder by association is a neder, so matvis b'shvua shvua, so matvis by shvua is also going to be a shvua, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chaf Amid Beis.